I was standing at the kitchen counter when Thomas's phone buzzed. He had left it next to the fruit bowl before going out to the garage, which he did every Saturday morning. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't that kind of wife. At least I never thought I was. But the screen lit up with a message, and the name on it made me stop breathing for a second. I told myself it meant nothing. It was probably work. It was probably a client. Thomas was a project manager, and he got messages at all hours. I set the phone back down. When he walked in and saw my face, something shifted in his eyes. Not guilt. Not at first. It looked more like calculation, like he was running numbers in his head. "There's no one else, Nora," he said. His voice was steady, calm, the way it always was when he wanted me to believe him. "I swear on my life." He held my gaze. 34 years of marriage, and I knew every expression on that man's face. But I also knew when he was performing one. Before I could say a word, the kitchen door swung open, and his mother, Evelyn, walked in from the living room. She had been staying with us for the week, which I had agreed to because she'd had a knee procedure. She was carrying a coffee mug and wearing her reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead. She looked at us both, then laughed the way she always did, light and breezy, like nothing in the world was serious. "Oh, Thomas," she said, "you and Caroline have been so careful for months. No need to keep lying to your wife like that." The room went completely silent. My coffee mug slipped in my hand. I caught it, but just barely. 34 years. 2 children. A life we built from nothing. And in one single sentence from a woman who had never truly respected me, it all came apart. "My name is Nora Whitaker. I am 62 years old. I spent over 30 years as a registered nurse, and for most of that time, I was proud of my ability to stay calm under pressure. You learn that in hospitals. You learn to breathe when everything is falling. You learn to keep your hands steady even when your chest is tight. That night, my hands would not stop shaking. After Evelyn said what she said, she seemed to realize it the moment the words left her mouth. She tried to take it back. She said she must have mixed Thomas up with someone from church. She said she was foggy from her knee medication. She laughed again, but it was a hollow sound like air leaving a punctured tire. Thomas jumped in fast, agreeing with her, saying his mother got confused sometimes. I didn't say a single word. I walked to the guest room, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The hurt wasn't the sharp kind. It was the deep kind. The kind that settles into your bones slowly, like cold water finding its way through a crack. It doesn't come from surprise. It comes from realizing you already knew, somewhere far back in your mind, and chose not to look. I thought about the last 2 years. The business trips that ran longer than usual. The evenings he spent at the office when I knew his project was already finished. The birthday dinner he was 40 minutes late to because of traffic. The way he tilted his phone screen slightly away from me when messages arrived. I had noticed all of it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I lay back and stared at the ceiling until the house went quiet. I did not cry. I was too hollow for tears. I thought, very slowly and very clearly, I am not staying in this marriage. The next morning, Thomas knocked on the guest room door before I was even dressed. He knocked twice, soft and careful, like he wasn't sure I'd answer. "Nora," he said through the door, "please, can we talk?" I opened it. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was wrinkled and his eyes were rimmed red. He started talking right away. Evelyn was confused, he said. She had mixed up names. She was on pain medication and hadn't been thinking clearly. There was no Caroline. There was no one else. He swore it again. I let him finish. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, Thomas," and went to make coffee. While he was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table with our bank statements and credit card bills from the last 2 years. I kept every one of them in a folder in the filing cabinet. I was always the one who handled finances. Thomas had no patience for paperwork. I went through every page carefully, the way I used to review a patient's chart. I was looking for anything that didn't fit our life together. I found it almost immediately. Dozens of things I couldn't explain. Restaurant charges in neighborhoods I'd never been to. Hotel stays on dates. Thomas had told me he was at conferences. Online purchases that were never delivered to our house. A recurring charge from a jewelry store downtown I had never noticed because it appeared between larger items. I had always trusted him. That trust had been my blind spot. When Thomas came downstairs, I was still at the table with the statement spread in front of me. "Explain these," I said, and slid one page toward him. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. Then he said I was imagining things. He said I was looking for trouble that wasn't there. He said I should trust him. I stacked the papers, put them back in the folder, and walked upstairs to call a lawyer. A close friend from my nursing years had divorced 5 years earlier. When I called her that morning, she didn't hesitate. She gave me the name of the attorney who had handled her case, a woman named Ruth. Sharp, thorough, completely unafraid of difficult situations, my friend said. I called Ruth's office that same afternoon. I got an appointment for the following Tuesday. Ruth was a small woman with silver hair pulled back neatly. She kept taking off her reading glasses and putting them back on while she listened to me. She didn't write anything down at first. She just listened without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "Good. You came early. That gives us time to do this right." She told me to document everything, print every bank statement, write down every specific incident I could remember, with dates. She told me to stop talking to Thomas about the affair directly. Say as little as possible about what I knew. Let him think you're still uncertain, she said. Uncertain people get careless. We'll be ready when they do. That evening, Evelyn came to the house while Thomas was at a neighbor's gathering down the street. She let herself in with the spare key she'd been given during her recovery. She sat down across from me in the kitchen without asking. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Nora, some things are better left alone. You're not a young woman. You've had a good life here. Think carefully before you tear it apart." Then she added something that told me exactly what she thought of me. "Don't be foolish about this." I looked at her calmly. "I've already decided," I said. "I won't stay married to a man who lies to me." She left without finishing her coffee, and I felt, for the first time in days, something that was close to solid ground. By the end of that week, Thomas agreed to move out temporarily, his words, not mine. He said he needed space to think things through, which I found interesting since he was the one who had been lying. I said very little. I told him that seemed reasonable. The moment his car left the driveway, I called a locksmith. Every lock in the house was changed within 2 hours. Ruth filed the divorce petition the following Monday. She also requested temporary spousal support, pointing to the income difference that had existed since my retirement the previous year. I had stepped back from full-time nursing specifically to support Thomas through his heart procedure. I had reorganized my entire life around his recovery. Now I understood that while I was doing that, he was using the peace and quiet I had built to fund something else entirely. That particular realization was one of the worst ones. Then came the first major discovery, and it was worse than anything I had already found. While Ruth and I were reviewing financial records together, she noticed something I had missed. Thomas had been making small, quiet withdrawals from our joint retirement account over 19 months. No single withdrawal was large enough to trigger a warning alert. But together they added up to an amount that turned my stomach. Ruth confirmed it directly with the bank. The withdrawals were real and documented. I sat in her office and felt the blood leave my face. That retirement account represented every year I had worked, every shift I had taken, every financial sacrifice I had made alongside Thomas for decades. I had trusted him completely with those funds. He had taken them and spent them on a woman who was not his wife. Ruth filed to freeze all remaining joint accounts the same afternoon. By the time Thomas found out what had been done, there was nothing left for him to move. Thomas found out about the frozen accounts on a Thursday afternoon. I know the exact day because he showed up at the house that same evening, which meant he drove straight from wherever he was staying the moment he got the news. Evelyn was with him. I opened the door and looked at them both on the porch. Thomas was red-faced and breathing audibly. Evelyn stood beside him with her arms crossed and her chin up, the way she always positioned herself when she was arriving to deliver a verdict on someone else's life. Thomas started talking first. He called me bitter. He said I was lashing out. He said every withdrawal from that account had been for household expenses he simply hadn't kept receipts for. Which was the weakest explanation I had ever heard from a man who had just spent close to 6 figures maintaining a secret relationship. Evelyn added, in her measured tone, that only a small and vindictive woman would do what I had done. I let them both finish completely. I waited until the porch was quiet. Then I said, "Would you like to see the bank records?" I picked up the folder from the side table just inside the door and held it at arm's length. Thomas looked at it. His mouth stayed closed. "Ruth has copies," I said. "The court will have copies. You're welcome to come in and review them, but nothing you say today will change what's already been filed." For a long moment, Thomas just looked at me. The anger on his face shifted, slowly drained. And what came up underneath it was something I had not seen from him in a very long time. It was fear. He and Evelyn left without another word. I closed the door, went to the kitchen, and made tea. My hands were steady. For the first time in days, I felt like myself again. The first formal mediation session was scheduled 3 weeks later. Ruth and I prepared carefully. She had already requested Thomas's phone records through the discovery process, and we were waiting on them. She told me to let the mediation play out without revealing everything we knew. "Let him talk," she said. "Let him commit to a story." Thomas came in with his own lawyer, a man named Aldrich, who wore expensive suits and spoke slowly like every word cost him money. Evelyn was not permitted in the room, which I could tell bothered Thomas more than he let on. When the mediator asked Thomas directly whether there had been any extramarital relationship during the marriage, Thomas looked across the table at me and said, with a steady voice and complete calm, that there had not. He swore there was no other woman. His lawyer nodded beside him like this was a satisfying answer. I looked down at the table and said nothing. Ruth set her pen down quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't even react. She just said that she would need a few minutes to review some documents, and she opened her briefcase. The phone records had arrived that morning. Hundreds of calls and texts over a 22-month period, every one of them to the same number. Ruth had already run the number through a reverse directory. It belonged to a woman named Caroline, a 48-year-old real estate agent based in the next city. Ruth placed a summary page on the table in front of the mediator. Thomas saw it from across the table. His lawyer leaned over and looked at it. For a long moment, no one said anything. Thomas's calm expression did not break, but something behind his eyes went very quiet, like a light being switched off. The mediator called a recess. In the hallway, Ruth touched my arm and said, "He just perjured himself. We're done with mediation." Ruth sent a formal legal letter to Caroline the following week. I didn't know how she would respond. Part of me expected silence, or a cold reply from her own attorney. I had imagined her as someone who knew exactly what she had been doing and felt nothing about it. I was partly right, but wrong in one significant way. Caroline called me directly. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the backyard with a book I couldn't concentrate on. I kept reading the same paragraph without absorbing it. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and something made me answer it. She started talking before I'd even said my name. She sounded scared, not of me specifically, but of what was now moving. She told me everything in a rush, like she needed to empty it before she lost her nerve. 2 years. She confirmed the timeline. The hotel stays, the restaurants, the gifts, the trips. She confirmed that Thomas had told her repeatedly he was going to leave me. He always said soon, she told me. He just kept saying soon. She cried twice during the call. I stayed quiet and let her say what she needed to say. I had looked up my state's recording laws the week before, not because I expected this, but because Ruth had told me to be prepared for any contact. I was in a one-party consent state. I had pressed record before picking up. Every word went on to that recording. When she finished, she apologized to me. I didn't know what to do with that apology, so I thanked her quietly for calling and ended the call. I sat in the yard for a while as the light faded. A dog barked somewhere nearby. The evening felt strangely still. I sent Ruth the recording that evening. Her reply came back within 20 minutes. "This is excellent. Well done." Thomas's lawyer filed a motion trying to have my financial documentation excluded from the proceedings. The argument was technical. Something about how the records had been gathered, but the judge saw through it immediately and denied the motion within a week. Ruth had expected it and was prepared with a response already drafted. Then Aldrich tried a different strategy. He began framing me in hearings as emotionally unstable. He used phrases like confused by grief and reacting out of pain rather than fact. Suggested that my financial concerns were driven by irrational fear rather than documented evidence. He implied, without quite saying it directly, that a woman of my age going through this kind of shock could not be relied upon to interpret records correctly. Ruth dismantled each claim methodically. She presented the bank records clearly. She presented the phone records. She presented Caroline's recorded call. The judge was a careful woman who asked precise questions and did not appear impressed by Aldrich's framing. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept calling me. Sometimes the calls were threatening. She would remind me what Thomas's family had contributed over the years, as if a holiday ham and some babysitting canceled out 34 years of a fraudulent marriage. Other times she would call crying, asking me to think about what I was doing to her son, asking if I had any compassion left. Each call made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not guilt, strength. Because every time Evelyn called, I saved the voicemail. I wrote down the date and time. I noted the tone. I had a file of these calls growing steadily in my phone. Ruth had told me to keep everything. I kept everything. The financial audit the judge had ordered came back with its initial findings during this period. What it revealed was going to change the shape of the entire case, and Thomas's lawyer had no idea it was coming. The audit took 3 weeks to complete. A court-appointed financial examiner went through every account Thomas and I had shared, and several others he had opened alone that I hadn't known existed. Ruth called me when the findings were ready. I drove to her office and sat down across from her desk. She slid a summary page across without saying anything first. She let me read it on my own. Thomas had spent more than $87,000 on Caroline. The examiner had tracked every dollar. Restaurant tabs that sometimes ran into hundreds in a single evening, hotel stays that stretched into week-long trips on dates when I believed he was attending industry conferences, jewelry store purchases, flights booked, and a set of wire transfers to an account in Caroline's name. Ruth's team had identified those transfers as consistent contributions toward her monthly mortgage payments. He had helped pay another woman's mortgage while I managed our shared household budget and assumed we were building a future together. I set the page down on her desk and looked at Ruth directly. $87,000, I said. At minimum, she replied. The examiner believes there are additional amounts not yet fully traced. We spent the remainder of that afternoon working through strategy. Ruth believed the findings substantially strengthened our position. She wanted to push for a much larger share of the marital assets, full recovery of the retirement funds, the house, and alimony at a rate that truly reflected what Thomas's decisions had cost me. I agreed with every proposal she put forward. But I told her something else too, something I needed her to understand clearly. This was not only about money. I wanted the truth placed permanently in the official court record. I wanted a judge to hear it and sign her name to it. Ruth looked at me steadily and said, "That's why we go to trial." Evelyn's deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late autumn. I was not in the room. Only Ruth, opposing counsel, and the court reporter were permitted to be present. But Ruth called me right afterward and asked if she could come by. I said yes. She sat down at my kitchen table with her folder in her lap. For a moment she just looked at me with something close to quiet satisfaction. "She made a serious mistake," Ruth said. Evelyn had arrived prepared to support Thomas's version of events. She told Ruth, under oath, that she had not been aware of any relationship her son had outside the marriage. She said she had no idea who Caroline was. She said her comment in my kitchen had been a confused remark caused by her pain medication. Nothing more, nothing deliberate. Ruth then asked her one follow-up question. Had Evelyn ever met a woman named Caroline, in any setting in connection with her son's life? There was a pause. Ruth described it to me later as the kind of pause that makes a whole room hold its breath. Evelyn said no. Ruth placed a receipt on the table. A lunch charge paid with Evelyn's own credit card at a restaurant downtown from a Tuesday afternoon 14 months earlier. She had also subpoenaed the restaurant's reservation records. The table that day had been booked under Evelyn's name for 2 guests. Ruth asked who she had lunched with. A longer pause this time. Evelyn admitted it was Caroline. Evelyn had known about the affair for well over a year. She had shared a private meal with this woman. And then she had stood in my kitchen, watched Thomas deny everything, and backed him up without a single moment of hesitation. The court reporter recorded every syllable. Is all of that on record? I asked Ruth. Every single word, she said. 2 weeks after Evelyn's deposition, Aldrich contacted Ruth with a settlement offer from Thomas. I received a call from Ruth on a Friday afternoon, telling me to sit down before she explained it. Thomas was offering me the house outright and 60% of the retirement accounts. In exchange, I was to sign a confidentiality agreement, stating I would not discuss the affair, the financial findings, or Evelyn's deposition with anyone. Not friends, not family, not the public. I asked Ruth to read me the confidentiality clause again. Then I said no. Ruth had expected this. She told me she had already drafted a response letter. She explained that from a purely financial standpoint, the offer was reasonable. I would be comfortable, the house was paid off, and 60% of the retirement was still substantial. But she also said that if I wanted to refuse and go to trial, we had an exceptionally strong case and the outcome was likely to be better. I want the truth on the record, I told her. That's what I've wanted from the beginning. Then we go to trial, she said. That same evening, Evelyn left a voicemail on my phone. I heard it once, immediately understood what it was, and did not delete it. Her voice was sharp and controlled, the way it always was when she was truly angry but trying to sound composed. She said I was a spiteful woman. She said I would destroy Thomas and then be left with nothing. No husband, no family structure, no one who cared whether I lived or died. She said I would die alone in that house and deserve every bit of it. I saved the voicemail. I texted Ruth a note that night. She left another one, worth hearing. Ruth responded, "Save it. We may use it." I went to bed that night and slept better than I had in weeks. The trial began on a cold morning in early December. I wore a dark navy suit I had bought specifically for this. Not to perform anything, just to feel like myself. Steady, prepared. The same way I used to feel before a difficult shift at the hospital, when I knew the people in my care needed me thinking clearly. Ruth had coached me the night before. Speak slowly, she said. Answer only what's asked. Don't perform calm. Just be honest. The truth is the most persuasive thing you have. I was the first witness called. The judge was a woman in her late 50s. Her expression gave little away. She watched me as I took my seat on the stand, and I looked back at her and waited. I spoke for almost 2 hours. I described the 34 years of our marriage, the early years when we had very little and made every decision together, the years I worked night shifts while Thomas built his career, the year I cut my own hours to manage everything at home after his heart diagnosis. I described the sacrifices I had made, not to sound like a victim, but because they were facts and they were relevant. Then I talked about what I had found, the bank statements, the amounts, the dates. I spoke calmly and clearly. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I answered every question Ruth asked, and every question Aldrich asked too, including the ones designed to make me seem unstable or bitter. I didn't give him that. When I stepped down, I walked back to my seat without looking at Thomas. But I felt him watching me. When our eyes crossed for a moment, he looked away first. In that small thing, I saw his certainty cracking. The man who had always believed he could manage any situation quietly, without consequences, was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. Caroline was subpoenaed to testify. I did not know how she would behave when she arrived. I had spoken to her exactly once. That Tuesday phone call in my backyard. And the woman on the phone had sounded frightened and remorseful. But people sometimes change between a private conversation and a public courtroom. Sometimes they find a different version of themselves under pressure. She did not do that. Caroline walked into the courtroom in a plain gray coat. She sat down in the witness chair and folded her hands in her lap. She answered every question directly. She confirmed that her relationship with Thomas had begun approximately 2 years before the divorce proceedings. She confirmed the timeline of events, the trips, the dinners, the financial support. She confirmed that Thomas had told her repeatedly over those 2 years that he intended to leave his marriage. He said he was going to leave soon, she told the court. He kept using that word, soon. Aldrich cross-examined her for over an hour, trying to find an inconsistency, trying to introduce doubt about her account or her motivations. She didn't crack. She answered everything with the same quiet steadiness she'd brought to the stand. When Aldrich suggested she had initiated the relationship and that Thomas had been a passive participant, Caroline looked at him with something close to disbelief and said that was not accurate. She was excused. She did not look at Thomas on her way out. She did not look at me either. I watched her go. I felt something complicated. Not anger toward her, not sympathy exactly, but something in between. She had been used too, in a different way. Thomas had made promises to both of us that he had no intention of keeping. Evelyn, sitting in the back row, was red-faced and rigid in her seat. She had come in looking like she was prepared to witness her son's victory. She left during the lunch recess without telling anyone. The second week of trial was when things shifted hard, and I had to hold my ground more firmly than at any earlier point. Aldrich's team had been quiet for 2 days. Ruth told me not to read silence as safety. Quiet from opposing counsel usually means they're loading something, she said. She was right. On Thursday morning, Aldrich introduced documents into evidence. My own medical records from the year I retired. He told the judge I had visited my doctor 3 times in a short window and had received a prescription for anxiety medication. He argued this showed I had been emotionally unstable and that my interpretation of the financial records should be treated with caution. It was a desperate move. I could see the judge's expression tighten as she assessed it. Ruth stood up immediately. She had prepared for exactly this. She called my former nursing supervisor as a character witness, a woman who had worked beside me for 18 years. This woman spoke about my judgment, my composure under pressure, and my reliability with complete and specific authority. Ruth also introduced a letter from my personal physician stating plainly that the anxiety prescription had been a short, routine response to a major life transition, and that I carried no ongoing condition of any kind. Ruth then addressed the judge directly. Experiencing anxiety after retiring from 30 years of demanding clinical work, she said, was not evidence of instability. It was evidence of being a person. The judge sustained the objections. She noted for the record that the medical history had no bearing on the documented financial evidence already before the court. Aldrich moved on. He had used his last card, and it hadn't played. That evening I sat on my back porch in the cold December air, breathing slowly. 2 more days. Just 2 more days, and this chapter of my life would finally close. The judge delivered her ruling on a Friday afternoon. The courtroom was quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something final is about to be said. Not peaceful, just still. Thomas sat at his table with his arms folded. Aldrich had a pen in his hand that he kept clicking and unclicking. I sat beside Ruth with my hands folded in my lap and kept my breathing even. The judge spoke for about 20 minutes. She went through the evidence methodically. She noted Thomas's false testimony during mediation. She noted the financial audit findings. She noted Evelyn's deposition and what it revealed about the duration and concealment of the affair. She noted Caroline's testimony. She noted that Thomas had depleted a shared retirement account to fund an extramarital relationship over a sustained period, while I had reduced my own career to support his health. Then she gave her ruling. I was awarded the family home outright. I was awarded 75% of the remaining joint retirement accounts. I was awarded alimony at a monthly rate that reflected both the duration of the marriage and the financial harm Thomas's actions had caused. And Thomas was ordered to pay my legal fees in full. Ruth put her hand briefly on my arm. Across the room, I could hear Aldrich speaking quietly into Thomas's ear. Thomas did not move for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like someone absorbing a blow they should have seen coming a long time ago. Evelyn was not in the courtroom for the ruling. She had stopped attending after the second day of testimony. I walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon light. Ruth walked beside me and said, "That was as complete a win as I've ever seen." I thanked her. Then I stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing the cold air, feeling the weight I had been carrying for months begin to lift. Thomas filed an appeal within 30 days of the ruling. I had expected it. Ruth had expected it. It was predictable. One final attempt by a man who had never truly accepted being wrong about anything. The appeal process was slower and duller than the trial. There were motions filed and counter-motions returned, dates were set and then pushed back. Ruth managed most of it without needing much from me, which I was grateful for. I was worn down in a quiet way. Not broken, just deeply tired, like the feeling at the end of the longest shift of your life. I was spending those weeks settling into a new rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the back porch of a temporary rental, volunteering twice a week at the senior center, sleeping better than I had in years. The legal process continued in the background like a slow machine, and I tried not to let it consume the life I was carefully, deliberately beginning to rebuild. About 6 weeks into the appeal period, Evelyn called me. Her voice had changed. The cool authority was gone. She said Thomas had been hospitalized. His heart condition had worsened severely under the weight of the ongoing proceedings. The doctors were watching him closely. She said she was sitting in the hospital, and she was frightened. Then she said, "Please drop this, before you kill my son." I sat quietly for a long moment after she said that. Whatever I felt about Thomas, and I felt many layered, complicated things, I had not set out to destroy him. I had spent a career keeping people alive. That was still part of who I was. I called Ruth and made an offer. I would not contest the appeal timeline if Thomas dropped the appeal entirely and accepted the original ruling. I would also cover his specific hospital bills from my settlement. Thomas accepted within 2 days. The appeal was formally denied 6 weeks later. A 3-judge panel reviewed the full case record and found no valid grounds to overturn the original ruling. Everything stood. The house, the retirement accounts, the alimony, and the legal fees ordered in my favor. Thomas's attorney sent Ruth a written confirmation that no further legal action would be pursued. Ruth called me the next morning. I was outdoors trimming the hedge along the back fence of my rental property when my phone rang. I set down the clippers and stood in the cool morning air and listened to her carefully. She read me the key language from the panel's denial, slowly and clearly, the way she did everything. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I exhaled deeply for what felt like the first time in months. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I said back. After we hung up, I stood in the yard for a long while. One side of the hedge was trimmed neatly. The other was still wild and uneven. The sky was gray and soft, and somewhere beyond the fence, birds were calling back and forth to each other in the quiet morning. I thought about Caroline. Through people we both knew, I had heard that she and Thomas had parted ways not long after the financial reality became clear, after the ruling, after the assets were divided, after there was nothing left to offer. The version of Thomas she had believed in had not survived the court's full accounting of who he actually was and what he had actually done. I want to be honest about how I felt when I heard that. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. It was simply too late for feelings like those. What I felt was quieter and cleaner than any of that. Relief. Pure, complete, unglamorous relief that it was over. I picked up the clippers and finished the hedge. The family home sold 4 months after the ruling became final. I had lived in that house for 26 years. Our children had grown up in it. I had painted every room at least twice. I knew the sound of every floorboard and the exact angle of afternoon light in every season. But it was too large for one person, and it carried too much. I found a cottage about 40 minutes outside the city, at the edge of a small lake. It had 3 rooms, a narrow porch facing the water, and a wood stove in the corner of the living area that I used almost every evening through that first winter. The nearest neighbor was a couple named Ben and Fran, who were both retired teachers. They brought me soup when I first moved in and have been steady, uncomplicated friends ever since. For the first 2 weeks in the cottage, I did not make a single plan. I woke up when I wanted to wake up. I made coffee and drank it on the porch. I read books. I took long, slow walks around the lake in the early morning when the water was still and the light was coming up flat and pale through the trees. I let myself be quiet. It was the first time in 34 years that I had lived completely alone. I had expected it to feel like a wound. Instead, it felt like space. Real, breathable, genuine space. I joined a volunteer program at the local senior center about a month after moving in. I started with one morning a week, helping run a light exercise group for residents with mobility issues. Within a few weeks, it became 2 mornings. The center director asked if I had a nursing background. I said yes. She looked relieved and asked if I might consider taking on a small advisory role for the health committee. I said yes to that too. I was not finished. I was just starting differently. I had been settled in the cottage for about 3 months when I finally finished going through the last boxes from the old house. Most of what I'd kept were books, photographs, and files. The files I had been putting off. They were the kind of paperwork that accumulates in a long marriage and doesn't feel urgent to sort through until the marriage is already gone. One afternoon in early spring, I sat on the porch with the last box and started going through it folder by folder. Near the bottom, between a folder of appliance warranties and a folder of old tax returns, I found something I had completely forgotten about. It was a set of documents from a title company. I almost set them aside without reading them. Old house paperwork, I assumed, probably from when we refinanced years ago. But something made me open the folder. They were transfer documents, dated 9 years earlier. Thomas had attempted to transfer partial ownership of our family home into Evelyn's name. The transfer had not been completed. There was a rejection notice attached, something about documentation requirements not being met at the time. But the intent was clear in the paperwork. The language in the accompanying note, written in Thomas's handwriting, described the transfer as a way to protect the asset in the event of future claims. I stared at that phrase for a long time. I photographed every page. I called Ruth the next morning. She was quiet for a moment when I explained what I had found. Then she said, "That's attempted fraudulent transfer of marital assets, 9 years ago. We may be able to use this to recover additional compensation." She paused again. "You have good instincts for finding things, Nora." I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in a while. 3 weeks later, Ruth had secured a supplemental settlement from Thomas's remaining assets. It wasn't enormous, but it was additional, and it was just. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from a number I recognized. It took me a moment to place it. Then I remembered. It was the direct line for the floor where Evelyn had recovered from her knee procedure. She must have listed it when she was admitted again. It was Evelyn. Her voice was thin and slow in a way I had never heard from her. She said she had been in the hospital for 2 days with a serious cardiac issue. She said the doctors were uncertain. She paused, and then she said, "I was hoping you might come." I held the phone for a while after she hung up. I went the following afternoon. I brought nothing. I had no plan for what to say. I drove to the hospital and found her room and sat in the chair beside the bed. She was smaller than I remembered. The authority she'd always carried, that certainty that she was the most important person in every room she entered, had gone. In its place was something much more ordinary, an old woman who was afraid. After a while, she said she was sorry. She said she had known what Thomas was doing was wrong and had told herself it wasn't her place to step in. She said she had been trying to protect her son. I believed her. I also understood that protecting her son had required her to not protect me, and that she had made that choice knowingly, day after day, for well over a year. I sat with her for 40 minutes. I did not say I forgave her, because I hadn't yet decided whether I did. I didn't offer reassurance. I just stayed because I was able to, and because walking out felt like something I did not want to carry. She thanked me when I stood to leave. I nodded and walked out into the hallway. Thomas came to my cottage on a Saturday afternoon in early summer. I was on the porch reading when I heard tires on the gravel path. I looked up and recognized his car. He had kept it in the settlement, one of the few things he'd held on to. I set my book down and waited. He came around the corner of the cottage and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked older than the last time I had seen him in the courtroom, thinner, and with something worn into his face that hadn't been there before. He wore a plain shirt and kept his hands in his pockets. He said hello. I said hello. He stood there a moment. Then he began. He said he had been thinking. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He said he regretted more than I knew. He said he had let something real slip away, and he understood that now. His voice softened in a way that I recognized. It was the voice he used when he genuinely meant something, which had once meant a great deal to me. He asked if we could try again. I let him finish completely. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't look away. Then I said, "No, Thomas. The man at the bottom of my steps was not the man I had married. The one I married 34 years ago was flawed and sometimes difficult. But he was trying." Somewhere along the way, I couldn't say exactly when, he had stopped trying and started deceiving instead. And what he had built his deception on was my trust, which he had used up quietly and thoroughly over a long time. He nodded once. He said he understood. He turned and walked back to his car. I watched the gravel dust settle after he was gone. Some doors close for good. That is not tragedy. That is simply the truth. The idea for the scholarship came one evening at the senior center. I was helping a young nursing aide fill out a complicated insurance form. She wasn't a resident. She was maybe 26 years old, working double shifts to pay her daughter's daycare while she studied for her licensing exam. She came in before her shift 2 mornings a week, which meant she arrived at 6 in the morning. I started bringing her coffee. We talked while we worked through the paperwork together. She told me she had wanted to be a nurse since she was a little girl, but time and money had never aligned the way they needed to. She was doing it slowly and on her own, carrying everything herself. I drove home that evening, still thinking about her. I kept thinking through the night. I thought about my own years in nursing, the long overnight shifts, the weight of exhaustion, and the specific pride that comes from doing hard work that genuinely matters. I thought about the women I had known throughout my career who had chosen that profession not because it was easy, but because difficulty didn't stop them. I called a financial advisor the following week. Together, we established a small annual scholarship fund, drawn from a portion of my settlement for nursing students. Priority would go to single mothers raising children while completing their education. The process of formalizing the application and selection criteria took a few months. The first scholarship was awarded that autumn to a woman in her early 30s, a second-year nursing student who was raising 2 young boys entirely on her own. I attended the small ceremony. When her name was called, she cried openly and without apology. I did not cry, but it was very close. It was the best thing I had ever done with money. Nothing else in my life came near it. Evelyn passed away in late autumn. The cardiac issue from the summer had not fully resolved, and her body had not been strong enough to recover. Thomas sent me a short text message, not a call, to say she had gone peacefully. I sat with the news for a long while. I thought about who Evelyn had been to me across 34 years. She was never cruel in the ways that leave visible marks. She was polite at the dinner table. She brought appropriate gifts. But she had never truly seen me, not as someone whose life and feelings carried the same weight as her own family's. I think she had always viewed me as temporary, as useful but replaceable. When she finally had to choose between protecting her son and being honest with me, she chose him without a pause. And yet I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed. I remembered how small she had seemed. Thomas called 2 days after the text. He asked if I would attend the funeral. I thought about it through the night. Then I said yes. I went on a clear, cold morning. The church was one I had attended many times during our marriage. Holidays, family milestones, occasions that had once felt significant. It looked unchanged from the outside. I felt very different standing before it. I sat in the last row. Thomas was at the front with our son, who was grown now with his own children. I spoke to no one. I did not approach the casket. I sat quietly through the hymns and the readings and the brief, measured eulogy. When it ended and people began moving toward the exit, I stood, pulled on my coat, and slipped out through a side door. It was the final moment of that chapter. I felt it close behind me, not bitter, not relieved, just finished. clean. Like stepping out of a room you know you'll never need to enter again. Today is a Tuesday morning in late spring. I'm on my porch with coffee, watching light move across the lake. The wood stove won't be needed again until October. The hedge along the south wall has grown past where I trimmed it last fall. I'll get to it this weekend. Fran brought me tomato seedlings yesterday from her garden. I've cleared a small bed along the east wall for them. I have no real history with gardening, but I'm willing to learn. That's something I've found about this part of my life, the willingness to try things I never had time for before. I volunteer at the senior center twice a week. The young woman whose insurance forms I helped with passed her licensing exam in February. She texted me a photo of herself holding the certificate. I printed it and put it on the wall beside the kitchen window, where I see it every morning. I have not spoken to Thomas since he came to the cottage that Saturday. I think about him, sometimes, not with longing, just the way you think about a significant chapter of your past. He exists in the history. He does not exist in the present. Here's what I have learned, and I'll say it plainly. I never raised my voice. I never did anything dishonest. I did not become bitter, though I had every reason to. I stayed who I was, careful, patient, steady. I documented everything. I trusted the right person. I said no when no was the only honest answer. I walked away with everything I deserved, including the one thing that cannot be settled in any courtroom. I walked away knowing exactly who I am. If something in your life doesn't match what you've been told, trust what you noticed. You are not imagining it. You are not overreacting. The woman they expected to stay quiet is writing this from a cottage by the lake. She has never been more at peace. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you know what it feels like to have your voice taken away by someone who smiled while they did it, then you already know why Brooke's story matters. This is the kind of story we tell here. Real stakes, real consequences, real people who refuse to fold. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because the stories coming are even more powerful than this one, and you don't want to be the last person to hear them. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? And what part of Brooke's story hit you the hardest? Share this with someone who needs to hear that staying quiet can be the most powerful move you make, and that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. We'll see you in the next one.